It's Game Boy World, and I'm Batman. We've seen games based on manga before, but April 1990 brings Game Boy its very first title based on American comics. And of course, it's Batman. Although, I suppose it would be more accurate to say Batman the video game is based on a movie, not a comic. Yeah, Batman got a start in the pages of Detective Comics a bazillion years ago, but this particular outing is based entirely on 1989's Batman movie, directed by Tim Burton.
You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight? I always ask that of all my prey. I just like the sound of it.
I feel like Batman 89 is fairly unloved these days, with its rubber costume and Mr. Mom as its protagonist. It comes off as a bit goofy, even campy compared to the so serious tone of Christopher Nolan's Batman flicks. But in 1989, Batman was a revelation. Most people, the millions who didn't follow comics and had never heard of The Dark Knight Returns, still thought of Batman in terms of Adam West and the Batusi. Burton's Batman was comparatively dark, with crazy Art Deco cityscapes and a brooding soundtrack. So while Batman 89 seems pretty hokey today, at the time it was a big deal, and this Batman was specifically licensed to ride the coattails of that cinematic juggernaut. It definitely isn't based on the comic Batman, because the Dark Knight has no compunctions about running around with a gun straight up murdering dudes here. That's a definite no-no for comic Batman, but Burton played fast and loose with the rules. This was built specifically to tie in with the movie, and honestly feels like a more faithful adaptation than the SunSoft developed NES game by the same name. Batman on Game Boy consists of 12 stages in 4 areas, all specifically keyed to the movie's major beats. The action begins with Batman eavesdropping on Commissioner Gordon at a party in Wayne Manor, then advances to the Axis Chemical Factory, where Batman battles future Joker Jack Napier. The second set of levels takes place at the Flugelheim Museum, while the third plays out as an expanded rendition of the brief Batwing sequence in the movie. And, naturally, the adventure culminates in the Cathedral, where Batman faces down the Joker. Unlike in the NES game, there are only 2 bosses on foot here, Napier and the Joker. So I guess it's just one boss, since it's the same guy. All the weird additions the NES game made to the film's plot, like the battle with Firefly, are nowhere to be seen, presumably because of the more limited space of Game Boy cartridges. As adaptations go, it's about what you'd expect from a 1990 movie license. Coming from SunSoft, it's pretty solid, but it takes the movie and reduces it to a series of platforming and shooting challenges, with the barest thread of plot linking it all together. Movies as platformers was basically the de facto form of video game licensing at this point. Media properties as brawlers wouldn't come into vogue for another year or two, as Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was still quite new at the point during which this game was being developed. And Batman the video game absolutely goes through the motions when it comes to platforming. Batman runs and jumps, he can swap out his current weapon for a new one by picking up the appropriate icon. There's a scoring system at play here, probably to compensate for the simplicity of the action, so half the item drops are bonus points. Batman the video game offers a very rudimentary form of destructible environments. Bonus goods are stashed in small blocks that Batman can destroy. Destructible blocks come in 2 shades, light and dark, and only dark blocks contain items. The light blocks either serve as obstructions to keep you away from the goodies you're trying to collect, or as temporary platforms to interesting alternate routes. Sometimes they're both, and collecting goodies by destroying a stepping stone to a higher tier of the stage locks you out of getting to the really good stuff. That's about as complex as the level design gets though. Mostly it's fairly standard stuff, with more hostile enemy positioning the further you get into the quest. By the time you reach the cathedral, you have objects falling directly on Batman's head if he pauses to get his bearings on small platforms, as well as durable weapons occupying precious footholds. There's a bit of nastiness into the level design in Batman, really. The game designers clearly had a deliberate policy of screwing the Caped Crusader over whenever possible, frequently littering his path with terrible power-down icons. Batman can switch between guns by collecting the proper icon, but not every gun is worth carrying. The best guns, naturally, pop up only rarely in the course of the game. The mighty Batarang, which has limited range but tremendous power and the ability to hit enemies on the rebound, appears infrequently, and the devastating laser is even less common. Meanwhile, the game is only too happy to put the lame normal gun directly in your path, or worse, the pitiful short gun, which essentially cripples Batman. Knowing where these items will appear, and when not to shoot a gray block, is absolutely of the essence. Stumbling into a power down is even worse than picking up the wrong sub-weapon in Castlevania. Batman also has to be mindful of a second kind of weapon icon, a small gun symbol that upgrades the number of projectiles he can have on screen at once. That's great and all, but if you pick up the black gun icon versus the white one, you lose 1 point of weapon capacity. Needless to say, the black guns show up with the very same sense of malice as the white ones. Batman was not a game created by nice people. Further complicating all of this is the fact that Batman is a pretty terrible jumper. You have more aerial control over this version of the hero than the one on NES, but even so, it's all relative. Batman has a tendency to over or undershoot his mark. This can be really frustrating on the final set of stages, which consists of lots of tiny footholds and many moving platforms. While it has its rough edges though, Batman for Game Boy isn't too shabby. There's a nice sense of progression to the stages, reminiscent of Ninja Gaiden, though nowhere near as cruel. The music is fantastic too, and aside from some fuzzy jumps, the action controls pretty well. SunSoft approached the inevitable Game Boy compromise by sacrificing visuals for playability. Batman won't win any awards for looks with its teeny tiny sprites, but the miniature Batman sprite here means the proportions of the screen feel decidedly NES-like. The stages are minute enough to offer multiple routes to the end, including one sequence in which you have to choose between 3 different tiers, each of which contains its own unique set of bonuses and bad guys to deal with. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Batman is the first action game since Super Mario Land to really feel properly up to the standards of the NES. Ignore the visuals and focus instead on the speed, systems, and level design, and you have a pretty solid 8-bit creation. Admittedly, it's not a patch on Batman for NES, but that was something of a high watermark for the system in its prime. It's hardly fair to expect something of similar quality this early in Game Boy's life, if ever. And SunSoft knew it too. Rather than try and stuff the dense, sophisticated NES game onto a far more limited platform, they built this Batman from the ground up. The result is a much simpler take on the concept. Batman can't alternate between fists and projectiles here, nor can he wall jump. Similarly, the free-scrolling, multi-leveled stages of the NES game play out a simple left-to-right jaunts here. No, Batman simply runs, jumps, and shoots. Oh, and sometimes he flies. Stages 7 through 9 go the extra step to differentiate Game Boy Batman from its console counterpart. They take place as auto-scrolling side-view shooter stages. This isn't the first time we've seen a horizontal scroller on Game Boy, and to be sure, this rendition of the genre is far more basic than Nemesis. In terms of complexity, it's even simpler than Solar Striker, if such a thing is possible. No power-ups, no advanced features, just simple shooting. The 3 shooter stages grow in complexity as you fly, to the point that the third one has 2 crazy boss-like ships to defeat. Mercifully, the shooting portions are extremely lenient with hitboxes, or else this game would be utterly impossible on Game Boy's screen. Even so, the shooting can be nerve-wracking, with tons of bullets and some fairly demanding enemy patterns. It doesn't help that anytime you die, whether on foot or in the Batwing, you're thrust back to the beginning of the stage. And these are not short stages. Batman's levels are quite lengthy for an 8-bit platformer, which is good in that you're getting lots of content, but bad in that there are no checkpoints and every single level tends to have some kind of nasty trick or surprise towards the end to throw you off your stride. Not knowing when to call it a day is kind of a recurring issue with this Batman. Not only do the stages drag on too long, so do the few bosses. Joker particularly is just a ridiculous bullet sponge. Not really difficult, but so slow to go down that the fight is basically a test to see if you can repeat simple patterns a few dozen times without making too many mistakes. Overall, it's a pretty solidly made game, although it basically has nothing to do with Batman. If not for the Joker fights, cutscenes, and character sprites, you'd never know that this was a Batman game. It could be any number of generic SunSoft action games. Journey the Silliest too, maybe. As licensed games go, though, it's easily the best we've seen on Game Boy to date. It doesn't suffer from the slowdown or flickery visuals most other developers seem to fall prey to on the platform, and it's much less of a slog than, say, Castlevania the Adventure. It helps that this was clearly an in-house production. Batman's entire staff role consists of SunSoft internal staff, with credits ranging from NES games like Platoon to main programmer Akihiro Asada's work on the Saturn conversions of the MYST series years later. Of particular interest here on Game Boy World is the involvement of Reiko Sakai, who served in a design role both here and on ultra-rare visual showcase Trip World. Trip World is as gorgeous as this version of Batman is perfunctory, so clearly Sakai and her collaborators just needed some time to ease into the hardware. Quite a bit of the Batman NES staff contributed here to the Game Boy title, which makes its complete divergence from the console game mildly surprising. Then again, the two games launched about 5 months apart, which does explain its simplicity. Outside of Nintendo, the prevailing attitude for Game Boy development has been outsource it, with studios like Tosei and Atelier Double showing up time and again. Heck, even Nintendo leaned on Minakuchi Engineering for Solar Striker, and Intelligent Systems was technically an outside studio when they helped with most of the launch library. Batman is part of the minority of Game Boy games we've seen developed by the company whose name graces the box rather than being shipped out to a lowest bidder, and it shows. Even with its rough edges, Batman is a step above the usual fare. Puzzle games may have dominated Game Boy's early years, but that doesn't mean we won't see plenty of attempts at action games. So it's nice to see a good one every once in a while. For more pixel art renditions of Michael Keaton, keep watching Game Boy World. The series is made possible by Good Vibes and support through Patreon, so, FYI. Next time, pretty much the polar opposite of Batman as far as licensed characters go.
I have given a name to my pain, and it is Batman.
And disappear at will.